Nazywam się Robert Konieczny. Prowadzę pracownię.
My name is Robert Konieczny. I run KWK Promes architectural studio. In art projects, movable elements of various scale appear relatively frequently. However, what at the first glance seems to be only opening and closing in these buildings is in fact a much larger interference in the space around them. The first building in which we used mobility was Safehouse, which initiated a new thinking process at KWK Promes on the space and changing possibilities of its shaping, which should always lead to increased functionality. Just like the aesthetics of moving elements that always form a coherent unity with solid parts, which results in purity and minimalism in the designed shapes. These two aspects, the variability of the space around the building and their aesthetics, are a characteristic element of our subsequent mobile project, in which moving parts increasingly serve not to close but to open, often in an unusual way around the space. The first building that I'd like to present is the Safehouse, where the form is completely secondary. The building is more than just a construction. The first project was not accepted by our client due to his specific safety requirements. This is the second one. When I was on my way from the meeting with the client, I had to reset myself, think about it in a different way. At the same time, the Atrium house was under construction. I have to describe the Atrium house history first in order to explain where the idea of the Safehouse comes from and how it works. In the Atrium house, there was a problem with the driveway. Actually, with the side of it, because it was placed on the southwestern side where the garden was supposed to be located. That is what became the motive of our project. Take a look, that's the idea. We can see an optimal location of the building in terms of sunlight and the opening onto the garden. The driveway has been lowered on the level down and leads up to the house. Coming in, you can't see what is happening in the garden. To make the communication comfortable, an atrium has been created in the middle of the building where the driveway rises back to the ground floor level, making it possible to park on the ground level. Here you can see finished building. We are in the driveway zone and then moving under the building and reaching the inner atrium exactly in the entrance zone, which is accessible for visitors. To get to the garden, we have to go through the building, and only then we are in the intimate zone accessible only for inhabitants. This scheme shows that a new type of building was created. That's why it's called Atrium. There is a double A because a classic Atrium house has got an entrance from the outside, and there is an intimate garden inside, whereas here the entrance is inside and everything opens onto the outside. Let's return to the Safehouse with a view from the street side, where the fence gates are opening. While designing it on the second attempt, I was constantly designing a similar zone to the one in the Atrium house. This zone can be reached by everyone, but it separates us from the garden. However, there is one difference. In the Atrium house, it occurs on two levels, as the driveway is lower and the garden is higher. In the Safehouse, it takes place on one level. Then the idea turned up. I thought, what if these dividers disappeared? And then we had it. Take a look at how it was applied to the architecture. When the building is closed, it looks like this. But every morning when it opens onto the garden, its two unusual shutters, eastern and western walls, move and connect with the fence. The house connects directly with the public zone, meaning that the daytime area is being extended to the surrounding garden. Children playing in the garden can't get outside to a busy street accidentally, one of the most important factors about the building functions. You can see the plan of the house when it is closed and the plan of it when it is open. This scheme shows that when the house opens, it connects directly to the public zone while maintaining the intimacy of the garden. Movable elements of the building change the spatial layout of the plot by making spheres. And importantly, It could look like this, or completely different. It could be a traditional house with a red roof, white walls and completely different fence. However, if it worked like this, it would also be a safe house because it is important how it works and not how it looks. Okay, but this is what our house looks like. We aimed at obtaining an absolute architectural coherence of still and mobile elements. The only exception is the southern gate because it acts as a screen for evening projections, which can be watched from the garden. When all these elements of the house open, we obtain one big day space and the fence becomes a part of the building, as if it defines the space in a completely new way. The next project I would like to present is our museum in Szczecin, Center of Dialogue Przelomy. Szczecin used to be a German town before World War II, and in the place of our building there used to be a quarter of tenement houses which were destroyed during the war. After the war, Szczecin became a Polish city and quite accidental square appeared in the place of the former quarter of tenements. Then the square witnesses some more tragic events in December 1970 when 16 demonstrators were killed fighting the communist militia, and since then the square became a place of remembrance. Hence the idea to establish a museum about recent history of Szczecin right there. An international competition was announced, and when we arrived there for the first time, the square looked like this. There was a monument called the Angel of Freedom dedicated to December events, and right next to it the construction of Szczecin Philharmonic Hall, designed by Barocci Vega, was supposed to stand out. Back then we already knew that the building of Philharmonic Hall would be iconic for the city, and we decided to keep our building in the background. We decided to combine two contradictory traditions of the place in our building: the pre-war quarter of tenements and the post-war square. Here's what the concept looks like illustrated. You can see the pre-war quarter and the post-war square, and our concept that combines those two traditions to create an urban hybrid, the square and the quarter. We needed some foreground in front of the Philharmonic Hall and in front of the church, so we stayed at the level of the pavement. In the place where we could mark the former quarter of tenements, the square is slightly elevated. To the right-hand side we set the corner building of the museum, and to the left-hand side the square again gently lifts to separate the square from the congested road traffic. As a result, an amphitheatrical space was created. We strove for a homogeneous, monolithic character of the whole thing. Therefore, we dedicated it to a single material: concrete. You can see how the division lines in the square match on the facade, so that everything really gives an impression of being made out of monolithic blocks of concrete. When you take a look at the situation now, it is hard to tell which part of the square actually holds the museum. It's only the section through the ground floor that shows it's only a small section of the square where the museum is placed. That was the initial scope of the competition. We decided it would make much more sense to design the entire square, as that is violating the principles of the competition, and it was fortunately appreciated by the jury. Unfortunately, nobody increased the budget for our design. Coming back to the building. Underground, the exhibition space is located at the -1 level, and you can also see it in the cross-section. The ground floor is actually an extension of the square, and it constitutes the main entrance area. What you can see here is the entire square with the elevated corner housing the museum. To the right-hand side, you can see the building of the Philharmonic Hall. When you are standing in front of the hall, you can see a flat square creating a sort of foreground before the building. The same flat area was left in front of the church. When you look at the square from the side of the Philharmonic Hall to the right-hand side, you see an elevation that separates the square from the road traffic, and to the left-hand side, you can see the gently sloping corner hiding the museum. There are two entrances leading up to the museum from the square and from the corner. The entrances to the museum are hidden behind revolving walls, which, as you can see, are found to be quite intriguing by school students. Once they are closed, you have an impression of monolithic structure. It was a huge challenge for us to design the installation in such a way that it would end up with a pure facade and primarily a pure square, for reasons of usability. It was even trickier to encourage our installation engineers to come up with innovative solutions which could be hidden. Finally, they did it, and we've even managed to convince them to use a picture with no visible installations as their advertisement. Let's return from the square to the entrance. When you stand perpendicularly to the facade, you can see the inside of the museum, which highlights the monolithic concept as it's made of the very same concrete boards as the facade along with the revolving walls. Right here above the glass panes we hit slits taking the air so that we don't barbarize the facade. Descending into the exhibition space, you have to cross the boundary between two different worlds. The entire underground is painted black. This idea sprang up at the time of construction when it turned out that we would not be responsible for the design of the exhibition space. We were concerned about potential theatrical artificial elements of the interior design, and we tried to distance ourselves from that project. However, eventually the authors of the interior design invited us to collaborate on the project, and then we convinced them to get rid of theatrical elements and replace them with contemporary art that is less literal. Contemporary artists then joined the project. The black color was left there, serving as an ideal background for contemporary works of art. This is how a museum of recent history of Szczecin became an art gallery at the same time. The exit from the museum is a negative factor of the entrance, leading you back into the bright space outside. When the museum closes, life continues on the square. It's a place for riding a bike, skateboarding, or sledging in winter, as it is the only hill in the town. However, the town authorities were used to such a thing, and we actually had to face a ban on placing any sort of floor, letting people ride on or do sports on it. We were very much against it, believing that the square should unite people rather than divide them. It turned out it was not just the floor cladding, but also the topography of the square that might be problematic. The very first ceremony after the square was officially open ended up with a scandal. The most important figures stood lower than less important ones. The military didn't know how to march over the undulating surface. It received a lot of media coverage, and we had to actually explain it to the military how to march on it. But the veterans found the skateboarders the most problematic. It took us a long time of mediation to reconcile the interests of different communities, and now the square is used by many different groups in the town. We believe that it was our huge success, and as you can see, I contributed to the success in person. That was the day when the rules were changed and people could finally rollerblade or skateboard on the square. And importantly, the city authorities also understood that the square with its special topography could serve as a perfect venue for outdoor music concerts. The residents of Szczecin themselves understood that it is their place, a place of spontaneous gatherings such as the one during the recent anti-government black protest marches. It is now a place of many different events. Sometimes the square transforms into a large drawing board, where children leave their colorful ornaments. But then rain wipes the square clean, leaving it open to new experiences. Another building which concerns the topographic path is my ark, my own house, whose history is quite crazy. Everything started from finding a beautiful plot of land on the hillside of Równica mountain, and then I started working on the project. When everything was ready to start the construction, a building permit was obtained and the construction took off. Annoyingly, there were a series of landslips in the region at that time. a phenomena which had been unknown so far on that scale. My area was not in danger, but I still kept it in mind. Then I asked my constructor, what can I do? He just told me, you can minimize interference in the soil as much as possible, but how to do it when the retaining walls of my first house were in the soil at 22 meters? Then I asked my wife, what would you say if we changed the house a bit? She asked, how much? And I told her, completely. She asked me if I was joking because I had been designing this house for 2 years and then all of a sudden I wanted to change it. How long was I going to do it? I said, listen, 3 days so that the construction crew don't run away. I had to reset myself and remember why we actually bought this plot, for the magnificent view. Okay, so the house has to be framed for the landscape. We should achieve some view from each room, preferably if it was a one-story house. My wife had already wanted a one-story house. She was afraid of the wilderness around. Then I thought, okay, what if I slightly push up this ground floor away from the slope so that the only one face of the house was in a direct contact with the slope? Then the remaining part of the house containing the bedrooms would become an actual first floor. Then you can sleep safely. Another very important step was the sense of security when it comes to possible landslips. Not to violate the land so that the house is in harmony with the nature, I decided that this house would be a sort of bridge. I will support it only on 3 walls, on triangular trusses, under which water can flow smoothly. It was obvious to put there a gable roof because of the mountain climate and local planning law. And the last step, it still missed some technical space. Finally, we had to close the shape in order to stable the firmness of the building. The gabled roof turned out as an accurate mirror reflection of down foundation walls, giving the impression of an inverted roof. After cutting the end walls, the construction gained quite an interesting appearance, and the whole thing started resembling an arc. That's why it is called Konieczny's arc. Let's focus briefly on technology, as it is crucial here. In order to simplify the building and lower the cost, I decided that the construction walls would be the facade at the same time, and I would put insulation inside. Take a look, you can see a shuttered casing of the arc here. When concrete was delivered, the terraces were done at once. When the shuttering was taken off, parts of the casings were finished. You can see the reinforcement which is about to turn into facade. Just a roof is made of wood and second-hand shuttering boards so that nothing is wasted. It is covered with TPO membrane whose color resembles concrete. Here you can see all finished elements such as walls, ceiling and pocket in the floor, which was to be filled with insulation. This led to an interesting idea in accordance with construction physics. The insulation was moved 5 centimeters away from the walls to enable ventilation. Take a look at how it was made. There are small blocks of styrodur attached to the inside of the walls. Styrodur boards are screwed to them, and polyurethane foam is sprayed all over it, which is completely airtight. You can see small holes that remained after shuttering. They are used to ventilate the walls. You can see attached foamed boards which look like a salt cave. It frightened me a bit, but on the other hand, it inspired me to leave one of the boards uncovered and painted to look nice and be cheap at the same time. Let's move to the most important thing now. The house was supposed to be a frame for the view. However, it opens onto the northeastern side fully, and only partly from the south. Why is it so? The right side is a daytime space open onto the surroundings. On the left it was about the sense of security, and this is why there are bedrooms at this safe height. It's the view from the inside of the house. It is just a background for the view. On the left, the glass was moved to the edge of the building to enjoy the skyline of the mountains. From the south, they are pulled back, which creates a roofed terrace and protects from warming up the inside when it's hot. When the weather gets worse, the terrace can be covered with glass panels and we can continue using it. The interiors are very simple and minimalist, local wood and stainless steel, which optically expands these small rooms. It was also applied in the hall connecting the living room with bedrooms, as it is the only place where the sunlight comes in from the west. It works as a periscope. I was wondering if I should install extra shutters from the south in case of a heat wave. My wife asked them as well for a sense of security. I also had to think about an entry because one corner of the ground floor comes in contact with a hillside surface and there is a difference of about 1 meter in height. The idea was to apply a shutter, which is also a drawbridge. It connects the inside with the surroundings and completely changes the house when open. Then the whole surrounding and the inside become one space. When we look at the house at night, we can see light emerging from its bottom. It may seem to be illuminated. The truth is that the light comes from utility rooms because there are cracks where water flows. It is protected with the net which stops snakes from coming in. There I keep wood, household equipment and lawn mowers. To get out of there easily, another drawbridge was applied. By the way, at some point I realized that the house and the garden are a part of the mountain, a part of the hillside. I became aware that the best project of the garden would be no project at all. The best path leading to the house would be just a couple of stones, and the fence would be a temporary electric fence or lack of it. The animals which pasture around cut the grass perfectly. So, abandoning the fence and moving it to the outline of the building resulted in the general accessibility of the plot, but also in an interesting symbiosis between residents and animals. And importantly, I also wanted to have some lighting on the plot, which wouldn't violate its naturalness. That's why the casing of the ark became illuminated. It is a reflector and the whole house is a lamp. The ark's casing saved the lives of rally crew once. Thanks to its shape, nothing bad happened to the participants, and the construction turned out to be very tough, although I hadn't anticipated a collision with a jeep. Another situation sounds unbelievable, but reflects the everyday life of the forest. Animals living on the pasture treat the ark, and to be more precise, the space under its casing, as a home. They can find a shelter from the wind and rain, and the edges of the ark are used for scratching. It is amazing. I had never thought of it when the name was invented. The animals added another meaning to the word ark by living here with us in harmony. Another project on the moving architecture path is the Quadrant House. Investors wanted a simple, sunny and relaxing home, in some way responsive to the movement of the sun. They loved our Safehouse, its variability and mechanisms that created relationships with the surroundings. The plot of the house was located in the suburbs among the average single-family housing. We placed a rectangular block on it that corresponded to the wishes of the investors in terms of the functional program. Then we turned the part belonging to the ground floor to get as much privacy as possible from the side of the road. In the cut space, we placed a living room underneath the first floor, and in the perpendicular shape, the spa zone was located. Both spaces close the private part of the garden. The investor's request was a flat-roofed house. However, the local spatial law imposed sloping roofs. Therefore, from the street side, the house has a gable roof, and from the garden side, a flat roof. As a result, a non-standard and characteristic house was created. But most important, the investors wanted a home reacting to the location of the sun, which is why we use the Quadrant Motive, an old device used to determine the position of the stars. As a result, part of the building reacts to the sun and follows its movement, giving residents, for example, shade and pleasant airflow when they are there, but also control of sunlight in the building or extension of its space, about which we're going to hear in a moment. In the meantime, see what the already realized building looks like from the side of the driveway. The closed solid of the ground floor separates an intimate garden zone. The gable roof meets the requirements of the spatial law and refers to the surrounding buildings. There are no windows on this side. From the other side, that is, from the garden, the building seems to have a flat roof according to the owner's wishes. Looking from this side, you can see how the roof has been shaped to get it. This is a view from the west side onto the private zone. Here you can clearly see how a part of the building breaks off and begins to follow the second wing of the house. The moving part moves between the living room area and the spa, which separates private space of the garden. One of the functions of this mobile part of the building is a terrace, which, following the sun, protects the inhabitants from it, giving them a pleasant shade and airflow. Here we see the moment when the moving block approaches the living room. At this point, you can see his next function, that is, the extension of the space to which it reaches. In this case, it's a living room because its windows are open. Now we are experiencing what the residents of the mobile part of the building are approaching, as you can see, to the spa zone, closed by glazing. So we have another function here, shading of the space at which the mobile part is located. It is also equipped with external blinds, which protect the house from very low sunshine, but also staying protected from the wind. This is a view of the day zone, which is open on both sides, and the mobile part of the building approaching. It goes to the living room, giving protection from the low sun, without blocking the view. This is the view in the spa direction. Look at the shadow that appeared in the living room, thanks to this position. The departing elements reveals the technology by which it moves. We decided not to hide it, unlike, for example, flashings or other typical finishes, such as the edge of the terrace floor. We can see the detail of the rail on which the mobile part of the building moves. Thanks to the movement of this element, natural grass may grow underneath. This picture from the time of construction shows a combination of two worlds: classic, non-moving architecture and technology that makes it movable. This drawing shows how the idea of the quadrant turned into a technology that makes everything here work. We can already see the twilight, and the element moves seamlessly from one side to another, because during the warm evenings it often becomes an extension of one of the spaces. And when night comes, the 18-meter wide day zone is closed by sliding glazing. Initially, the solution, due to its width, was a prototype created only for us. After a year, Skyframe transformed them into a system solutions. Inhabitants of the Quadrant House discover new advantages of the mobility of their building every day, which translates into functionality and pleasure of life.